Okay, good afternoon, everyone. If you are tuning in, it is the Firefighter Cancer Initiative monthly scientific seminar series. We're going to give a few minutes for our attendees to settle into the Zoom session. So please go ahead and make sure you check your audio for this webinar. And our moderator, Dr. Tulay Koro-Sengal, will get us started in just a minute or two. We'll give about another minute to get started, and we'll take it from there.
Should we go ahead and start?
Yeah, let's go ahead. Let's do it.
Hey. Hello, everyone. My name is Tulay Koro-Sengal. I'm one of the faculty investigators for the Firefighter Cancer Initiative at Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center at University of Miami. I will be the moderator today in our monthly seminar series as part of Firefighter Cancer Initiative at Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center. I'm so happy to see many of you today to engage in a conversation with our very special speaker today for our last seminar of the year 2023. And I don't think that, our speaker needs an introduction to our firefighter community, but for those of you who are new to our seminar series, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Alberto Caban-Martinez. He's a great colleague of mine in the department, my research partner, but most importantly, he's a great friend. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Alberto Caban-Martinez was trained as a physician, doctoral level occupational epidemiologist. He's a certified public health researcher and a true researcher as part of community-based participatory research. He's a tenured associate professor in the Division of Environment and Public Health at Department of Public Health Sciences at University of Miami. He is the deputy director of our signature MD and PhD program at Miller School of Medicine. And at the university-wide level, he is the associate provost for regulatory affairs, assessment, and research integrity. He has over 10 years of domestic and international research expertise in environmental and occupational epidemiology. As many of our firefighter community know, Dr. Caban-Martinez serves as the Deputy Director of the Firefighter Cancer Initiative at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center, whose research efforts include underrepresented firefighter subgroups such as arson investigators, firefighter trainer, instructors, wildland urban interface, and volunteer firefighters. Before I give the podium to Alberto, I would like to let you all know that he was actually one of the 25 scientists from 8 countries who were invited to be part of meeting organized by the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer, we call it IARC, to finalize their evaluation of the carcinogenity of occupational exposure as a firefighter. Let's all welcome Dr. Alberto Caban-Martinez to our Firefighter Cancer Initiative's last seminar of the year. All right, Alberto.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Koro-Sengal. I am really excited to present, and I appreciate that warm welcome to the group. So to close out our seminar series for the 2023 years, I thought that I wanted to give you all an update on a brand new cohort study that we launched through the Firefighter Cancer Initiative. We call the cohort FICO. So don't worry, you will not be getting any FICO scores about your credit ratings at all, but rather this is an opportunity for us to take a closer look at a subgroup of the fire service workforce that are called fire investigators and fire inspectors. They're a small but mighty group of the overall workforce, and the FCI will be dedicating time and effort to supporting our fire investigators and fire inspectors through this cohort. So we call it FICO for short, and it's the FICO Health and Safety Assessment Cohort Study. So this cohort literally launched last month. And so I'll be presenting you some overviews of that study. So the goal that I want to achieve through this presentation is to be able to characterize for you some of the data that was collected from the launch cohort study. And I have two objectives. The first is I'll share with you a little bit about the study design for this cohort and the individual assessments that are completed at enrollment and at follow-up. And then also I'll summarize some preliminary data that we just started receiving already back from pathology lab and other of our optional procedures that I'm excited to share with you. Before I begin, I want to make sure that I acknowledge our funding source. The work that's done through the Firefighter Cancer Initiative would not happen at all without the state of Florida funding. Each year, the FCI is allocated funding from the state of Florida, which we have to compete for to fund the various projects, education, and clinical services that we provide through the FCI. In addition, the FCI is supported through the National Cancer Institute through the program grant, the P30, to Dr. Steve Neimer, who's our director and PI of the Cancer Center. And I don't have any disclosures to share with you for this particular study. I was recently appointed to the NIOSH Board of Scientific Counselors, but nothing that would impact the presentation that I'm showing with you today. All right, so I like to be interactive. If you know me, I like to ask questions and see who's paying attention. So in the United States, we have about 330 so million Americans, registered and unregistered. So do you want to give a guess of how many firefighters protect that community of US Americans? Right, so if we have around close to 335 million Americans documented and undocumented in the United States, as per the US Census, how many do you think make up the firefighter workforce? So if you said 1.1 million, then you are correct. So thanks to the National Fire Protection Association, they have estimated for us that about 1.1 career and volunteer firefighters make up the firefighting workforce. And notice I'm saying firefighters, which is different from fire service. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So it's estimated by NFPA that about 35% of that 1.1 million are career firefighters. So what you might think of in municipalities, working, say, in a county or a very populous city. And then we have about 65% of the firefighter workforce, the larger bolus being around 682,000 volunteer firefighters. So those are individuals, for those of you that are on the Zoom today that are not firefighters, those of you that work full-time, that could be you and me, that volunteer in our community to serve as a firefighter. And interestingly, in 2022, the estimate was around 7% of these firefighters were female. So a majority of the profession is male. And the NFPA also estimates that about 51% are between the ages of 30 to 49 years old. And there's around 30,000 fire departments across the United States. So what I wanted to share with you is that, and the focus of the FICO is two particular subgroups of the community. So you can see here that there are many different types of the fire service workforce. So in the United States, we think about our structural firefighters, whether they're paid or volunteer, but we also have dedicated airport firefighters. So every airport operated federally will have a fire station there to make sure that they are doing EMS, paramedic, and fire response for aircraft issues. There also exist military firefighters. So in different branches of the military, there are military firefighters that are serving and protecting the men and women that in turn protect us. There's another subgroup called the Urban Search and Rescue Firefighter, or USAR for short. These are firefighters that are specialized in training to do search and rescue. So for example, here in South Florida, where we had the Surfside building collapse, several urban search and rescues, both locally and nationally, responded to the collapse of those buildings. And these firefighters, who are general firefighters, structural firefighters, and from other walks of life, also serve in this capacity. Another type of member of the family of the fire service workforce are wildland and wildland urban interface. So we call wildland urban interface WUI for short, and then obviously our straightforward wildland. So those that are in wildland is literally, as they say, they do fire suppression in wildland. Sometimes they don't even use water; they use fire to suppress fire or move, the earth in order to remove fuel sources from them. And oftentimes, and of interest to us, is that they don't use personal protective equipment as frequently as our structural paid and volunteer firefighters. And then there's wildland urban interface. So this is communities that housing structures and residencies and commercial buildings abut wildland. And fire suppression techniques are also unique and special to WUI compared to wildland firefighters. Moving along, we have other types of firefighters called fire trainers. So for us in academia, this makes perfect sense. We have, the professors of the firefighters who are constantly training and educating existing and new incoming firefighters about different fire suppression techniques, equipment, and technologies that can be used in fire incident response. And now the focus of today's presentation and of unique interest to me are fire investigators and fire inspectors. In a moment, I'll define them for you so you have a better sense of who they are and where they come from. But these are very different members of the firefighting community. We also have private firefighters, and there's also industrial firefighters that work in areas and scenarios where there is industrial processes, right? So say like a tire making factory, that firefighters are present there and support and those things. So as you can see, if you look at the big picture from left to right, there are many different types of firefighters. It generates unique exposures and unique health conditions that merit that attention. And hopefully I'll make the case of why we should need to look at our fire investigators and fire inspectors. So first, let me share a little bit about them. So what is a fire investigator? So again, this is a very unique subgroup of the overall fire service workforce. But the primary objective of a fire investigator is to be able to identify and collect physical evidence from a post-fire scene incident response, trying to understand the etiology or the origin of that fire, what caused it to happen. And in some cases, it could be arson related, where it was purposely initiated fire, and it is the role of these fire investigators sometimes during the fire and sometimes way after the fire has been suppressed to investigate these. So you can imagine that a fire investigator is exposed to various vapors and particulates both in the air and on objects as they are combing through a scene that was on fire, and particulate aerosolizes and moves within and around them as they're collecting their evidence in their audit of that fire. And so these fire investigators can be exposed to different types of carcinogens in different routes, both through inhalation that they breathe in what's there and skin absorption. Anecdotally, it's our experience in talking to different fire investigators that they don't always wear their PPE when they're doing fire scene investigations. Sometimes it's because of dexterity or their visual field, or because they're moving quickly because the volume of work that they're doing requires them to move in a timely fashion. So you have a sense, the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that the entire United States, there's around 14,000 US fire investigators and inspectors. It's really hard to get a tabulation on the total number, but this is what the US federal government estimates that is present. So let me pivot for a second and talk a little bit about what are US fire inspectors. So the role for an inspector is to detect fire hazards, recommend preventive measures, and ensure compliance with any local, state regulations that can impact any type of building. They also review and approve different construction plans and issue permits that allow construction to happen for a particular building to make sure that fire technologies and safety is in place for there. Fire inspectors usually have 40-hour work week that they engage in, and they usually, it depends on the municipality and the geographic area in the United States, but typically work under a fire marshal so that they have authorization to enforce specific codes in that area where they're working. In some smaller communities of the United States, these inspectors are also both the fire marshal and the building official that allows permission for certain practices to take place. And to our knowledge, there is no health and safety data on fire inspectors. So we're really curious about who they are. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a current employment status of fire investigators and inspectors across the United States. This is data as recent as May of 2022, which for the federal government is hot off the press. And you can see that the darker the green, the greater the concentration of fire inspectors or investigators that are employed in that population. So there's a couple of states here and territories that don't have any data. So those are depicted in white, such as Alaska, Hawaii, Montana, South Dakota, and Arkansas, and the territory of Puerto Rico. But all the other states do have some information on labor employment statistics. And you can see here in Florida, we have a healthy representation of investigators and inspectors, which is usually a function of the populace and how many people live in a state. So as Dr. Caban suggested, one of the interests for us as physician scientists and is to sort of understand how we can limit carcinogenic risk in all members of the fire service. Most recently, the IARC International Agency for Research on Cancer released monograph 132 that has moved the classification scheme of the profession of the activity of firefighting from a group 2B to a group 1. So in the space of classifying what is cancer or not, this agency, the IARC, classifies these 4 categories. Group 1, indicating a high level of certainty that exposure to a particular substance is carcinogenic. Group 2, possible. Group 2B, probable. And Group 3, limited or no evidence that a particular substance causes cancer. What's interesting for us is that IARC has considered the activity of firefighting, and in its most recent working group has reclassified exposure to firefighting as a group 1, particularly for mesothelioma and for bladder cancer. And since the last monograph was released on firefighting, the last and the first, there has been an increase in evidence, even though still classified as limited, for colon cancer, prostate, testicular, melanoma of the skin, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. If you're interested in learning more about the monograph, feel free to use your mobile device and scan the QR code, and you can receive the executive summary, which is 2 pages that summarizes a very thick, large monograph on the state of the science on cancer in the fire service. So the most recent meta-analysis that informed that IARC monograph I just showed you is here. I tried to make it into an infographic to sort of summarize risk for the different cancers. You saw that both mesothelioma and bladder cancer are number 1, but some of the other cancers increased in evidence, and I'm highlighting them for you here so that you're aware of them and can take a look at them. So you see that there's some other cancers of concern beyond the 2, including prostate, testicular, colon, skin melanoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, thyroid cancer, and kidney cancer. Kidney cancer is in gray because there were too few cases and studies available in order to inform that one, even though it's showing a slightly elevated risk. So the reason that I present to you this today is because there is no research in the fire service. And to show you what I mean, I made a bar graph to have a better understanding of why there is a lack of science in both our fire investigators and our fire inspectors. So for us that are scientists, our awareness of what literature is out there in science is searchable through a portal called PubMed. So similar to us doing a Google search and trying to learn, what's out there in the universe, when we scientifically want to know what papers have been peer reviewed and published that can inform science, we go to pubmed.gov. So today, there's about 35 million papers published worldwide on many, many different topics in health and other topics. So 35 million papers, to put that into context. When you do a PubMed search just on the word cancer, you come close to around 5 million papers since PubMed has been indexing papers that are published on the topic of cancer. When you do that PubMed search and you restrict it to how many papers have been published in general on the topic of firefighters around the entire world, there's around 4,300 papers on the topic of firefighters. When you further restrict that search and look for fire investigators, interestingly enough, and piqued my curiosity, there were 19 papers. So, I was reading each one to try to understand what was being said. It turns out 18 of these papers were focused primarily on methodology, like the best way to collect evidence during a fire scene where you're auditing the fire scene post fire. So I was kind of bummed out because it was more focused on the methodology, but not really the health or the safety of fire investigators. So one paper, fortunately, did look at health of the fire investigator. It was a topic of cancer, and I'll share that with you momentarily. And then sadly, there are 0 papers that map to anything on fire inspectors, their health and their safety. So the one paper that is available on fire inspectors was published almost a year ago, December 2022, by my good colleague, Dr. Gavin Horn, and others, and Dr. Kenny Fent from NIOSH. And they were doing simulated burns on a residential structure and were air sampling around that structure after a fire to try to understand what a fire investigator may be exposed to during that fire scene. So there were different sampling times after the fire that were tested to see what a fire investigator would be exposed to. The first was immediately right after the fire suppression, and they tested those air samples up to even 5 days after the fire. And they were looking at airborne particulate over a wide range of sizes, even including really tiny particles like submicrons that could potentially reach the lower branches of our respiratory tree. They also looked at airborne aldehyde concentrations and tried to compare them to volatile organic compounds, which are characteristic compounds that we look for when testing air quality, particularly on the fire scene. The authors ultimately recommended that protection of investigators' airways from these particulates is really important during fire scene reconstruction activities, because you can imagine as they're moving parts of the scene, they're re-aerosolizing and reanimating a lot of these particles. And if they're not wearing PPE, they're obviously could potentially be dermally absorbing them if they're not wearing any gloves or long sleeves, as well as inhaling them. So ultimately, the recommendation was to use some sort of vapor protection from formaldehyde, particularly based on the number of days of the investigation. There is some thought that if the fire occurred many days ago, that the scene is very safe, but that's not the case, what was found in the study. So this really motivated us to design a project that we could study long-term the health of fire investigators and fire inspectors. And so the purpose of the FICO study is to create foundational data on the health and safety of U.S. fire investigators that ultimately informs health and safety practices for both the inspectors and the investigators. So the aim was for us to create an initial cohort and protocol that would look at both of these subgroups of the population and evaluate cancer risk, cardiovascular disease, musculoskeletal disorders, behavioral and mental health, and safety practices. And our goal was to start with 100 fire investigators here across the state of Florida, where our funding supports this type of work. So this is what the FICO study looks like. So this will be a long-term study. We would like to follow fire inspectors and investigators for over 30 years. The inclusion criteria is that you have to be an actively employed fire investigator or inspector, be at least 18 years of age, and be able to read and write in English. And the timeline begins when the fire inspector or investigator is presented the overall research study. We answer all of their research questions and send them to the study, and then ask them to complete a baseline health and safety survey, and then indicate whether they want to complete optional procedures. 1 year from the time of enrollment, we follow up with them again to complete an annual follow-up survey, as well as some of the select optional procedures. And I'll walk through those in details in a moment. So as you can see on the right-hand side, the main procedures for the investigator and inspector are to complete the consent form and answer the baseline survey. The investigator and inspectors then offered some optional procedures to inform other objectives of the cohort. So some are blood sample collection, saliva sample collection, engaging the exposure reporting app, the personal exposure record app, collecting wristbands, silicone-based wristbands, so that we can measure carcinogens in their work environment. We also at baseline, invite them to complete a musculoskeletal assessment so we can look at their joints and their muscles. And lastly, we ask them to provide us some toenail clippings over time so that we can evaluate heavy metal exposures from their occupational activities. So this is a broad overview of each of these components. So again, up at the top, the fire inspector investigator complete a screener, a consent, and a survey, and then have these optional procedures offered to them to complete. So we launched this project just a little over a month ago at the 75th anniversary of the Florida Fire Marshals and Inspectors Association. It is the longest serving fire prevention conference in the United States. And it really was an honor and a privilege to not just speak to our investigators and inspectors about cancer in the fire service. And thanks to our firefighter cancer registry team, including Dr. Tulay Koro-Singal, Dr. David Lee, Dr. Monique Hernandez, and others, we were able to provide preliminary estimates of cancer within inspectors and investigators at this session. So this was where we kicked off officially the cohort. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the individual components of the survey instrument, so you're aware of what we're collecting both at baseline and during follow-up at the 1-year mark. So at the enrollment, we asked investigators and inspectors to tell us a little about them, their social demographic characteristics. We asked questions that elucidate for us occupational and job history. We asked them to tell us a little bit about their workplace exposures and concerns that they have about those exposures. We assess sleep quality. We ask them about their engagement with healthcare. So for example, how do they access healthcare? How often do they use it? There are questions in the survey around cancer screening, risk behaviors related to cancer. We ask about cancer family history and cancer prevention practices. We also ask in the survey questions about cardiovascular disease, joint and muscle conditions and joint pain, and lastly, mental and behavioral health questions. So it is a very comprehensive survey. It takes our fire investigators anywhere between 20 and 40 minutes to complete, depending on their reading speed of the questions and also how they answer. The survey instrument is live, and so it cascades questions based on how the investigators and inspectors are responding to the survey. So blood samples. So we asked the fire inspectors and investigators to provide us with a couple of tubes of blood, and we at enrollment are conducting a lipid panel, checking for biomarkers of inflammation and cardiac health. We also evaluate blood sugar levels and their control of their blood sugar, and also are doing a multiplex assay where we're studying their immune system function. And this is in partnership with our Department of Pathology and Dr. Andrews, who we're incredibly thankful for helping us in processing all of our blood samples. We are also collecting saliva samples to evaluate the use of a non-invasive way, not having to collect blood, assessment for cotinine, which is tobacco smoke exposure, for cortisol, so that we can evaluate stress levels in our inspectors and investigators. We're also evaluating high sensitivity C-reactive protein, or CRP, so that we can learn about inflammation. We're looking at IL-6 and IL-1B. So these are interleukin-6 and interleukin-1 beta, which are molecules that signal information in the body about inflammation and other processes, which are helpful to us, particularly in the space of cancer and immune response. And then also use saliva to test for testosterone levels. And so these saliva samples are requested of the fire investigator. And I'm reminded on my left is our lead research associate, Miss Ashley Gray, who was very courageous and said, I would like to lead the coordination of the cohort. You can see her here working the lab at the conference site to be able to process these samples in real time at the venue. So not collected at enrollment, and then in future intervals, we are also asking our investigators and inspectors for clippings of their toenails. And this is for the purpose of assessment of heavy metals. So what you see on the bottom left is sort of like a half cut of a finger. And this is just to show you that when we grow our nails, they grow here over in this area denoted by the cuticle. And as our nails advance forward in time, they basically are a snapshot of what was circulating in our blood and create sort of like a picture of, what we were exposed to. So I think of them like rings of a tree. If you ever look at the stump of a tree and you see the rings, it tells you what the tree went through over time. So when you collect the clippings from the toenails, and we specifically ask for toenails because they are the slowest growing, the fingernails grow faster than our toenails. It allows us to be able to study these heavy metals. So I'm thankful to our co-PI, Dr. Shanta Dar from the biochemistry department, who is amazing with ICP-MS and other techniques to be able to take these toenail clippings and describe for us many different types of metals that are present in there, both healthy things that we need to know, for example, as calcium, and then other harmful metals like lithium and other things that our investigators and inspectors could be exposed to. Another optional procedure is using silicone-based wristbands. So at enrollment, each investigator and inspector is invited to wear wristbands. We leave them with a bag with a couple of empty, blank, quality-controlled, clean wristbands, and we ask them to wear it during a typical shift. So for example, in the case of a fire inspector, what is their typical work shift? Let's say 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. As they're conducting inspections, we ask them to wear it, and they complete a pre and a post survey in using those wristbands. And similarly with our investigators, we ask them to wear it while they're doing a fire scene audit, so we can see the types of PAHs that they're exposed to. For those of you that are new and are not aware, these PAHs are products of combustion. So anytime a fire burns carbon-like material, these PAHs, there's over hundreds of different of them, are emitted into the air, and these silicone-based wristbands work as a non-passive sampling device to capture them. And then we pass the baton over to our colleagues in the biochemistry department, Dr. Sylvia Darnard, Sapna Deo, Emery Tikiche, and Umar Bakali, who have been instrumental in being able to analyze the wristbands for these PAHs. So we're excited that the inspectors and investigators can wear them and start giving us real-time experience, not real-time, but real experience of what they're exposed to during their work shifts. For this particular cohort, we're also expanding to understand muscle and joint conditions in the fire service. You can imagine our fire inspectors and investigators do a lot of physical activity and sometimes get into really complicated situations as they're navigating themselves through structures that were burnt and have to collect data for it. So we were very interested in learning a little bit about their musculoskeletal health. So for this cohort, we evaluated range of motion for all the major joints in the human body. And we also conducted grip strength testing. So we'll show you some results today of that grip strength testing. We did what's called the sit and reach test, which is that blue box on your right. And it allows us to understand a little bit about the flexibility of these workers, and also the Apley back scratch test for stretching. And then the Romberg test of standing balance to evaluate their ability for proprioception and balance. So let me share with you a little bit about what we learned and what so far in this cohort. And again, I just want to emphasize this is very preliminary, as literally we started it last week and started to put something together for it. So this is a Florida-based cohort right now. In the future, we're excited to expand to it, and I'll give some details like our future direction so at the end. But in Florida, we currently have enrolled in the cohort, 3.4% of them are fire investigators, 34.5 are inspectors, and then very interesting and surprising to us in the data collection is that 58.6, greater than a majority of the sample, is actually both, and they self-identify as an investigator and as an inspector, which scientifically interests us in understanding the synergistic effects of these dual exposures if you're working both as an investigator and as an inspector. So here are the social demographic characteristics of those that are currently enrolled in the FICO cohort study. On the left, we can look at the age group distribution. So you can see close to half of the sample is 50 and older. So this is a very mature and seasoned worker group. It could be a function of our recruitment and those that volunteered to be in the study. But right now, we're close to half representation of those that are 50 years of age and older, with the other half being distributed between 19 and 49 years of age. The other really interesting distribution here is the self-reported sex of the individual. So normally we usually see like a 90-10 split in our structural, paid, and volunteer firefighters. There tends to be more women fire inspectors and investigators in this, so it was really exciting because we need to encourage and have data for not just the men, but also make sure that women firefighters are well represented in the data that we're collecting. You can see a majority considered themselves non-Hispanic, 82 were white, and then when we look at the overweight and obesity distribution, and again, this is all self-reported data, we can see that close to 80% of the sample is in the overweight and obese category. This is slightly higher than the national American average. Okay, so are you curious about the survey responses? Let me show you. We summarized just a little of them, not all of them, because there's a lot to do so. So the first one I want to show you is the self-reported rank. So for those that self-identified as fire investigator, the greatest proportion of representation comes from those that self-identified as being in a fire marshal role, then followed by other. So sort of the least ones were chief, battalion chief, and assistant fire marshal. Over on the right-hand side, where we look at the rank of the fire inspectors, the most represented are those that have a Fire Inspector 1 certification. Almost 50% of those that self-identified as inspectors had that level of training, followed by multi-level inspector training in the cohort. So when we asked about cancer diagnosis, 3 of the cohort members identified as having cancer. That comes out to 13%. Again, this is a very small sample and again, preliminary. And those cancers that were reported were breast, kidney, skin melanoma, and skin non-melanoma. So you may be asking, why do we have 4 types of cancers if there's only 3 people reporting? And it's because sometimes an individual can have more than one type of cancer during their life course. And so one of our participants reported 2 types of cancers. When we look at cardiovascular conditions, we can see we asked the participants to identify if their healthcare provider has ever diagnosed them with any of the following conditions. You can see dyslipidemia or high cholesterol being at 48.3, and then about 28% having elevated blood pressure. When we asked them about their muscle and joint pain, specifically their joint pain, you can see that the most frequently reported area of pain is the lower back, the neck, and the foot. We asked the participants, the inspectors and investigators, to tell us a little bit about what are their workplace concerns, their exposure concerns. And we gave them a bunch of different options, including other, for them to self-write in what their concerns were. So you can see on the bottom varying types of categories of concern. The bars in orange represent the investigators, those in the green were the inspectors, and you can see lots of variety in between the different types of roles and their concerns. So for example, dust particulate was a high concern among fire inspectors as they're moving through, understandably, as they're moving through perhaps older buildings that they're inspecting and have some particles there. But then also there were concerns around loud sounds and diesel fume exposure as they're moving through. When we compare that to our investigators, the greatest concern was again among dust particles, but also seeing some concerns around gas fumes and chemical spills that they have to deal with as part of their workplace movement. So let me share with you a little bit of the optional procedures. We only summarized some of the blood sample and muscle and joint. We're still working on analyzing other data that was collected as part of the optional procedures. But I wanted to show you a little bit about what we're learning in the blood. So we did a lipid analysis. This is no different than what you would get when you're going to your primary care and asking, to have your blood checked annually. So what we can see here is from left to right, looking at total cholesterol level, wanting to understand lipids in the blood. And we can see that, close to almost 50% have borderline high to high cholesterol. When we look at triglycerides, we can see that, close to 58% have mildly increased triglyceride levels. LDL, so low density lipoproteins, these are the bad cholesterols. This is the cholesterols that are circulating, that gets placed out into our blood. We can see about half of the participating cohort had high LDL, which is not good. And then when we look at HDL, high density lipoprotein, we like to call it the good cholesterol. We have to look at it stratified between men and women, as there's different levels of there. But you can see that among men, inspectors and investigators, 31.6 had poor LDL levels, so an opportunity to improve circulating HDL. And then among our women inspectors and investigators, 52.6 had poor levels of HDL. And then lipoprotein, which is a carrier molecule that also informs us about certain cardiovascular risk. We saw that about 25% of inspectors and investigators had an elevated level of lipoprotein A. We also took a look at their blood sugar levels and inflammation. You can see on the left where we measured what's called high sensitivity C-reactive protein. This is a molecule that's not specific to anywhere in the body, but it tells us overall inflammation. And we can see that, close to 20% had moderate to high CRP levels in the samples that were provided. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at a molecule called glycated hemoglobin. It's sometimes said to be hemoglobin A1C for short. And this is a biomarker that tells us how well you've been managing your blood over the last 3 months. And so you can see that close to 60-some% of the sample were at risk, right? So around 42% could be classified as pre-diabetes because their hemoglobin was between 5.7 and 6.4%. And then about 15.8 of our sample looked to be diabetic, but again, we needed 2 readings. This was only done one time at enrollment. So this is interesting to understand, cardiovascular health within this cohort. And now really interesting to me, because one of my areas of interest is musculoskeletal disorders. We captured a lot of different data, but one is the hand grip strength. So if you've ever seen this device on your right-hand side, it's called a dynamometer, and it's an ability for us to measure how well you can grip and how much pressure you can apply on each of your hands. In older, mature adults, it's a really good predictor of mortality. This has been studied around the world. And in some other contexts, it's also an indicator of certain other chronic conditions. So how well of a grip you can do on your left and your right hand. And so you can see that our inspectors and investigators are a strong bunch. You can see that, the average based on normative data that's collected around the world on hand grip strength, that our inspectors and investigators on the left hand had 88% were above the average, and then on the right hand, 72 were above average. So this is interesting to see, just curious about what it does and ultimately its ability to prognose other things of morbidity and mortality. So what are next steps for our cohort? So we are now in the process of activating the other optional procedures. Our participants have their wristbands, the personal exposure record app, and toenail collection kits, so that as they are going through their individual inspections and investigations, that they are recording those experiences on the personal exposure app, as well as providing back to us in the lab the wristbands, toenails, and saliva samples, so that we can continue to evaluate repeated exposures over time. Our next big assessment will be November of next year, when we return back to the conference and connect again with those Florida inspectors and investigators to repeat the annual cancer survey and reoffer some of the annual optional procedures that they complete. So I thank you all for your time and patience as we begin and roll out, this cohort. And then I'll turn it back to Dr. Koro-Singhal to help us moderate any questions, thoughts, or comments that you all have about the study.
Thank you so much, Alberto. We do have a couple questions, and I'm going to read the very first one. Have there been concern expressed among participants about assessing tobacco exposure as a behavior-focused risk factor versus occupational?
Yeah, this is a great question, because tobacco smoke exposure can happen in many different contexts, right? It could be work-related, and it could also be recreationally related. I personally have not heard any concerns specifically from the participants. They were excited to get their results because they're curious if they do have any tobacco exposure that's on there. What we are looking for in saliva is a metabolite of nicotine exposure, which is called cotinine. So we will be reporting those salivary cotinine results back to the individual inspector or investigator. And I lamented to say that the results that we're reporting back only go back to the study participant. So our team cannot disclose and will not disclose who's enrolled in the study, and certainly does not give the results back to the union or to the fire department of the inspector or investigators. But we're hoping that it helps them sort of identify point sources of exposure through their participation in the research study.
We had another question that you actually kind of answered it, during your talk, that is there a population differentiation identified for inspectors who are also investigators? I do see that in one of your figure that when you were describing the investigator and inspector, that like 58.6% on your sample, they were both inspectors and investigator, and our audience even like have a special name for it. I don't know whether you do read it, but it's like we have like very large group that they do have both, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the challenges that we have as a scientist, to differentiate point exposures from both occupations. It is possible to do, and because we are using the personal exposure record app, where we ask the participants to record their individual responses, we can get better nuanced information about how particular exposures and events may lead to certain health outcomes. But when you have an individual who's doing both, it can certainly be very challenging. And actually, you and I, Dr. Korver, were talking about this when we were trying to estimate cancer incidence within this group, because they have, some of them report both. And did the cancer occur when they were working as an investigator or as an inspector? It is no question a difficult component of trying to, move this forward. But we still need to collect that data in a more nuanced way, how we've designed it in the cohort, in order to be able to try to unravel some of those differences. So obviously, those that are pure investigators and inspectors are going to be incredibly important to the study, to just understand how exposures alone within that category of the fire service workforce impacts these health outcomes. But then we can also look synergistically, right? Because you can hypothesize that you would expect to see maybe greater of a particular health condition or outcome in someone that's in a dual role versus one. Yeah. Sometimes we see cases where the person worked for a certain period of time in their life course as an investigator, and then switched later on in their adult life into an inspector. And so the way that, because this is a cohort study, we'll be able to look at that over time and learn further about it.
We have another question about the expanding the cohort beyond Florida was mentioned. You mentioned that. And what is the strategy for expanding the study to other states, or even international too, I guess?
Yeah, so we've actually already received several requests to try to expand this to outside of the state. So our research team applied to FEMA for support as a research grant, as a scientific research grant, to originally do this cohort study. We were reviewed by both the fire service and scientifically, and the scientists provided us some feedback that they would like to see on this research project. So we intend to revise the FEMA grant and resubmit it in early 2024 for FEMA's further consideration to support us to expand the project on a national level. At the present time, we wanted to initiate it here in Florida because our fire inspectors and investigators requested that this happen for them, and also for our commitment to the IAAI, who has been an incredibly special and instrumental partner in helping us engage investigators into the study. So yes, that was a very long-winded response to say we want to expand nationally. We do need funding to do so, and we plan to resubmit to FEMA for support in early 2024.
Just a good follow-up question on this one, because your study includes investigators and inspectors, your I-square over there. And what are the plans to achieve the 100 participant goal? And what is the breakdown to be achieved between investigators and inspectors? I think this is a really nice question, because you don't want to end up having 100 inspectors, or not a good breakdown.
Yeah, so absolutely. So I'll be honest and say that the goal of 100 is mostly a function of funding. That's what we could enroll to keep our commitment to processing all the optional procedures and repeated measures that needed to get done for 100 individuals. We certainly want to be able to expand that target, and can, with additional funding, to do so. we're hoping that it could be, you know, a 50-50 split of investigators and inspectors. But given that we're learning now from this initial outreach that, you know, investigators and inspectors have these dual roles, we may change that sampling frame in order to increase the distribution. And I will be reaching out to Dr. Caban, our lead biostatistician, on the best strategy for that type of data collection. But obviously, the more the better, right? This is a very small subgroup of the population that we know very little about, and really does warrant, you know, a holistic approach to understanding their health and safety concerns that will ultimately inform other research projects, right? That we can do, that's based on the priority of what the inspectors and the investigators would like to see, and is useful ultimately for their practice.
I think the next question is more about, you know, your, like, what you collect from these participants. And the question is, do you track the use of protective equipment for those in the study?
Yes, we do. So there are 2 time points. Well, there's 2 assessments where they do so. So the first assessment's done at enrollment and each of the follow-up surveys. So we ask them in general how often, with what frequency they are using specific PPE during inspection work shifts and during individual investigation scenes. So that's a very general assessment of PPE, but we are also capturing it in the personal exposure recording app, so that when they're doing their individual assessments, we know what PPE they're using and if they did any rehabilitation on scene for the use of those PPE. So it's really in those 2 assessments repeatedly where we capture that information.
And the next question is about, actually, you know, before I really say this one, I was really impressed by your slide that, you know, you actually mentioned all these different types of firefighters. And now this next question is, are or will private inspectors be eligible for the study? For example, the insurance, you know, inspectors.
Yeah, yes, if they don't have to be in the public sector only. We do both public and private. That was made very clear to us by the our advisory board that on it. So both private and public investigators and inspectors are eligible to participate in the study. We want to know what they're exposed to in both settings.
Yeah, as far as I do see, you have a very general inclusion criteria, which is really nice, that more inclusive of, like, you know, everybody. I think the last one was a more like a comment than a question, and it states that, in my experience, you'll likely find most investigators and inspectors are dual role, like in your, like, a small sample right now. Also, most previously serve as a line firefighters, likely a primary reason for the older average age. You know, I think, you know, this is a really nice comment, because you will also, like, I think you might really, maybe, you know, you have a question, you know, in your study that you do ask before they were fire inspector or investigator, they were also in the other line of firefighting work, right?
Yeah, so a couple of comments here. So, you know, this was the first time we launched the cohort at the state conference for investigators and inspectors. And it's been my experience over the years that usually our mature firefighters, more senior firefighters, always want to participate in the research because they want to give back. They've been in the profession for a long time and feel very committed, compared to some of the younger fire service personnel who may be a little bit more reluctant about what does it mean to participate in a research project. So there could be recruitment bias initially in this, you know, small sample that we just started off with. Here, in terms of age distribution, it's certainly not a function of the, you know, the true population. I'm excited as we continue to roll out opportunities for enrollment into the cohort, that younger investigators and inspectors enroll, so that they can contribute, you know, more information and repeated information into the cohort that we're there. I wanted to mention that in our self-reported survey, we also asked the participants to identify other occupations that they have, other occupations being other roles in the fire service beyond inspector and investigator. So we are learning from this data, as we were compiling it for this presentation, that inspectors and investigators have also been firefighters, like structural firefighters, or are currently also working as a firefighter and have this additional role as an inspector or investigator. And so we are documenting that because we want to be able to control for that information and understanding exposures in the other type of job category. And beyond work in the fire service workforce, we're also asking them about second jobs so that we can look at the broader scope of occupational related exposures that the investigator and inspector may have. It is a very unique workforce that we're excited to hopefully be able to learn and document more about their experiences through here.
And also, I think the study really not only like focus on one disease like cancer, but you know, it also takes a look at all these other like disease groups as well. That which is, I think, the beauty of it. That will be really nice. I don't see any other questions. I do have a question now. You know, we asked the question about whether you are going to expand this fund to the other states, and now I'm going to ask you: are you also have planned to do the retired, you know, inspectors and investigators?
One step at a time. I'm a big proponent, increasingly more and more about quality over quantity. This came up to us as well during the conference if retired fire inspectors could be part of the study. You know, at present time, we're trying to collect information on our active firefighters to be able to document and learn about what you're exposed to at work impacting these health particular outcomes. In the future, we can certainly expand it. I don't see any reason why you know, having a survey like we do have the aerial cohort study that's dedicated to retired firefighters not exist for inspectors and investigators. But at this time, we're going to focus on FICO and making sure that we collect quality data for the inspectors and investigators going forward. So don't shoot me. We definitely respect retired inspectors and investigators, just not at this time.
But I love the acronym that you created. You're always so creative. That FICO is really nice, and you know, you can really remember. Thank you so much, Alberto. I think I'm going to give you the last word because this is our very last seminar of the year, and you're our deputy director as well. Please go ahead and close the session for us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I just want to say, you know, a big thanks to all of our inspectors and investigators. My list is long. You know, Jeff Polly, Tommy, Brian, there's John. John was instrumental at helping us launch this there during the Florida Fire Prevention Conference. Without your leadership and guidance in setting up the study and making it accessible to all the attendees, it would have never happened. You know, FCI looks comprehensively at all of the firefighter subgroups and recognize that every firefighter has unique exposures, and our goal to try to ultimately lower their burden and risk for cancer, never being able to achieve zero, but trying our best. As we close out this year, it's incredible to believe that we are about to encroach on 10 years of firefighter cancer research. It is thanks to our fire partners that we're able to do this. You inspire us as scientists and as healthcare providers to find solutions to be able to protect you from cancer. So we're incredibly thankful. We hope on behalf of the FCI, Dr. Kobitz, Dr. Shelley, and all of our FCI investigators that you have a restful holiday season and a new year. We are excited to kick off the firefighter symposium on the third week of February, the 22nd and the 23rd, here in Miami, back at home at the University of Miami Coral Gables campus, where we will also be announcing the two firefighters that were selected for the Torches Fellowship. It's one of the most exciting aspects this year, where we created a fellowship program for two firefighters to join the Firefighter Cancer Initiative, be paired up with a mentor scientist, and allow them to design and develop a project that they can undertake using FCI's resources for the year. So we'll be deadline for submission of applications is December 15th. I think that's 2 days from now, if my memory serves me right, or 3 days from now, which is online. And then before the end of the month, our advisory board will be selecting those two Torches fellows, and then we will announce them in February. So we're thankful again, you know, our firefighters make the difference. Wish you all a very happy holiday and a happy new year, and see you at the January Scientific Seminar Series. Bye.